Hey, what's up, Erie? Luke Bolinger with Erie Parks and Recreation. Once again, out at Schofield Farm Open Space with Erie's Old House, episode 4. And today we have a very special guest joining us today, Miss Patsy Holt, who I've been talking with for, we've known each other for about 5 years now.
It's a few years.
And she actually... We're still working on the house, so we got lots of activity behind us. So she actually visited the farm in her youth. So I asked her to come out here and kind of give us the lowdown on what Schofield used to be. So Patsy, thank you so much for coming out.
I appreciate you inviting me.
Absolutely. So let's get started. Why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself? Where were you born? Where did you grow up?
Okay. My parents both went to school in Lafayette, and my mother lived here at that time. My father and his family moved from Lamar, and they married in 1939. And when they married, they moved to Denver. And then I was born in 1940, and I'm named Patricia or Patsy because I was born on March 17th. And that's held ever since. And by the way, I sometimes use Patsy Schofield Holt as my name because my grandparents were the Schofields. Anyway, we lived in Denver until my father received his draft notice in World War II. And rather than go into the regular armed services, he chose to go into the Merchant Marines. Okay. So when he left, my mother and I came back, and we actually lived here for a few years. So this basically is my childhood home, much as I can remember, but I was pretty small back then. When he got out of the service, my folks purchased a home in Lafayette, where we lived for about 18 years. And I went to school in Lafayette, but we were very much connected to this house because my mother grew up and my grandparents, of course, still lived here. Mm-hmm. The first job I ever had was hoeing corn for my father. And that's taking a hoe and hoeing the weeds because it's too big to cultivate with a tractor and a cultivator. So a girlfriend of mine and I did that, and it was so hot. But his farm was down on the south end of Lafayette, a 410-acre farm. And today, the Lafayette City Hall sits on part of that acreage on the corner of South Boulder Road and Public Road. Okay. So we have many, many roots in this Lafayette area. The next job I had was a waitress at Jimmy's Lunch as a sophomore, and that was kind of fun, but tips were not great back in those days. Yeah. I also worked at the drugstore in Lafayette for a few years, and then after I got a divorce, my father hired me down at his Lafayette grain elevator, and I don't know if you know where that is. It's called the Silos now. It's out on East Baseline, and it's a spa of sorts, and they do massages and all kinds of things there. So I worked for him for a few years, and then when he sold, I went and got a job at Golden West Milling in Longmont, which is another grain elevator. And I worked there for 6 years, and then it was time to move on. So I applied for a job at a senior high-rise residence in Boulder called Golden West Manor. And I was hired there as the assistant to the administrator, which doesn't tell you a thing about what I did, but it was all the accounting and the rental of the apartments and overseeing the kitchen and the dining room area and the maintenance. And I was responsible even for ordering the light bulbs. So there were a lot of responsibilities that eventually got passed on, but it was such an enjoyable job. And I worked there 13 years and then retired in 91. Okay. So that's kind of my story, and I've been retired ever since.
Living the good life.
Living the good life. I moved to Brighton from Lafayette, and then I moved to Fort Lupton, and I'm still there.
Okay. Just a quick jaunt over here to Erie.
Not bad.
Right on. Well, can you tell our viewers maybe about your family and how they came about living at Schofield? You know, I've gone over the history a little bit, but you know, I'm really just reading from paper. So
sure.
I'd love to get and I'm sure our viewers would love to get your perspective on how Schofield came about to be Schofield.
Yeah, right. Well, Hiram Prince, who actually owned this property and a lot of other acres, like a section or two, was my great-great-grandfather. And he actually came to this area from the Mississippi River, where he was on a riverboat. But prior to that, I think he was born in Alabama. But he set up a blacksmith shop in Denver, and this would be in the 1870s probably. So he finally decided to move out of the Denver area, and he was able to purchase 2 different parcels of land from the Union Pacific Railroad. Mm-hmm. And this is part of that. But at any rate, when he moved to this area, he built himself a lovely brick home on the corner of Isabel Road and 287. That house is long gone, but I remember being there one time, a 2-story brick house. Along the way, I'll wait. After he came to this part of the country, my other great-great-grandfather, Henry William Schofield, and his family came from Nova Scotia. And most all the ancestors along this line were actually initially from England or Wales, but the Henry Schofields lived in Nova Scotia. And they came here over a period of many years. And during that time, they stopped and lived in several different places. Massachusetts and Nebraska are 2, I remember. But by the time they got here, they had 13 children. So that was the start of the relationship between the Prince family and the Schofield family. William Henry Schofield actually went to work for Hiram Prince at one point.
Yeah, lots going on today. Got to take advantage of the weather while we got it.
And during the time they were acquainted, the son of William Henry Schofield, who was my great-grandfather, Alfonso, he married the daughter of Hiram Prince.
Okay.
And that's where the relationship between the two actually started. The 2 of them lived in a cabin on Hiram Prince's farm for a while, and then they married, of course, in 1892, I think it was. In 1893, this property, this farm, and it has gone through various changes since that time, and it's only about 25 acres now, but it was more. And the deed which Luke is holding here is the actual deed from February 2nd, 1893, and it transfers this property to Mary Molly Prince, my great-grandmother. And Alfonso and Mary Molly lived here and had all their children. Well, no, I take it back. They had 2 children before they moved to this house. My grandfather was the first one born in this house, and that was just after the house was completed in 1897. And he suffered a fatal stroke in the same bedroom 67 years later. So his entire life almost was lived here. And he and his wife actually moved here after the death of my grandfather's mother because they felt like grandfather needed some help. So my grandfather asked if my grandmother would give up her new house, which is just up the road a mile, sits on the hill on the right side as you're going into Lafayette, and it's also a 2-story brick house, but she never got to live in her new house because she agreed to move here and ask for a new cook stove and a new icebox. Right. And you're familiar with an icebox. It's not a refrigerator. It uses ice to actually cool what's inside. So at any rate, they lived here then until he passed away. And the other place that they lived right immediately after they married was in Lafayette. And my mother was born in this house, and it was the first brick house built in Lafayette by Sidney Pascoe, who was my grandmother's father. And that house is still standing too at 103 East Simpson.
Right. Yep.
So we're dyed-in-the-wool Lafayettites, or whatever the word is.
Right. Yeah, and for our viewers, for the longest time, this Schofield actually sat what was Lafayette, and then we've talked about the post office basically readdressing the Schofield address some time ago to be an Erie address.
Right.
So that's why there's so much history, really intertangled between Erie and Lafayette.
Very much so.
We've talked a lot with the Lafayette Museum and the Erie Historical Society, and there's just so much intertwined history there. So, Patsy, what's your first memory of living on the farm, or do you remember your first memory on the farm?
I do, and it's not a very happy memory, but it so impressed me at the time. I mentioned that my father was in the Merchant Marines, and he was on a Liberty ship in the English Channel at this point in time. They were delivering to France jeeps and 5-gallon cans of gasoline to use in World War II. Their ship collided with another ship and sank, and there was fire everywhere. But my dad, being the radio operator on the ship, and the captain were the last ones to leave the ship.
Oh, wow.
And by that time, there were people trying to get them rescued, and my dad actually did get rescued and taken to England finally. But all these Merchant Marines were men without a country, so to speak, because they lost all their paperwork. They had to go through all of this in order even to come back to the U.S., which he eventually did. And let's see, my mother received a telegram saying that my father was missing in action, and that's the kind of notice you got back then. Mm. At any rate, this one particular day, she fainted on the kitchen floor, and I'm relating that to this telegram because I think that would actually, be the result
Here
of...
in this kitchen?
In this kitchen, yes, because she and I still lived there. And I really had no understanding of what was happening because I would have only been about 4.
Okay.
But that's my most vivid memory early on of living here and being in this house.
Wow. What? So building on your first memory, we'll get into some others. But what's your favorite memory?
Well, this, as I said earlier, this is my childhood home. And I've got so many fond memories of being here. I'm just going to cite a few of those so you kind of get a flavor of things that I did here. In the dining room, which is the room right behind us here, that was always where the Schofield family members, and this was a broad family to some degree, but we always had Christmas and holidays and birthdays here, and everybody would come. And primarily, my grandmother would prepare the meal. Nowadays, people often do a potluck kind of thing, but back then, it was she that did all the prep work, and all the women that came along also helped. But she would set the table with her finest china, sterling silverware, and delicate goblets that we had water in. We'd never served alcoholic beverages back then, but I still have these goblets. They're long stems and just so fine, and it was a special time, I think, for everybody, and particularly little kids who never got to see those kinds of things very much.
The big kid table.
Yeah. But my grandmother prepared these meals on a combination electric and wood-burning or coal-burning stove in the kitchen. And it had an electric oven and 4 electric burners, but it also had the side where they could burn coal. And it was necessary because the hot water tank was this tall monstrosity, probably about 1 foot wide and maybe 5 feet tall, had a pipe going in at the top which the cold water ran into. No, the cold water went into the bottom. At the top was another pipe, which allowed by gravity for the hot water to be sent to the bathroom and the kitchen. And they had to maintain fire in that stove in order to have hot water all the time. So that was something that a lot of people probably have never heard of, but always quite interesting to me. When we served the meal, all the women would have a dish or two of whatever we were serving, and we'd carry it from the kitchen to the dining room, and everyone would come in and sit down, and we would usually say grace ahead of the dinner. Once my grandfather's brother's son and his family, the son was little, he was a child, but his mom and dad were here, and they asked Val to say grace. So everybody's ready, and Val says, Godfrey, Godfrey, Godfrey. And I don't know if you remember Arthur Godfrey or not, but that's who he was talking about, I guess.
Got it done.
Yeah, but anyway, we all laughed about that. Afterward, the men would sit in the living room, and all the women would go to the kitchen, and one would wash the dishes, and two or three would have what we call tea towels to dry the dishes, because there was no dishwasher, of course, at that point in time. And the other thing, after everybody got finished getting the work done, we would all get into the living room, and my grandfather would usually have a box of Russell Stover candies to pass.
Ooh.
And if it was in a metal dish, I would scoot around on their wool carpeting and shock everybody when they took a piece of candy. So
that's hilarious. Just walking around with a candy, just shocking people.
Yeah.
You lived here for a few years, and then I think you were visiting.
Yes.
Every once in a while. What's a typical visit look like, and then how did those visits change seasonally? So, if you were visiting in the summer, how did that look different versus when you visited in the wintertime?
Well, I visited here a lot as a child, even clear up until teenage years. And early on, when I would come to visit, it would usually be on a Saturday night. And every Saturday night I spent here, we would drive to Longmont and eat at either Wayne's Cafe or George's sandwich shop. I can't remember, it had another name. But we would have a nice dinner, or we'd get sandwiches at George's. And after that, we would often go shopping at Woolworth's or Penny's or Elda's, which was a dress shop, and Foley's, which sold children's clothing and paint. None of those businesses are there any longer. And if we didn't go shopping, we would sometimes go to a movie. There was a movie theater in Longmont. So I always look forward to spending time with my grandparents.
You would come here and then kind of...
Yes, we would go to Longmont. And on the way out of town, we would stop on the south end of Longmont at a Johnson's Corner for ice cream cones. Okay. And that building is still in existence in Longmont. It's been moved south and west, but it's being held there for restoration, so that's something else coming up in the future. But good memories of that. Other times, my grandfather would take me out to the chicken house with him, and I really liked to go out there. It was very interesting to me, although I was really afraid of the chickens, being young. But he could reach into the nest under a hen and get the eggs out, and I never had the willingness to do that because I was afraid of being pecked. But once we gathered the eggs, we would go to the cellar, which is an underground, like a root cellar, and they had down there what they called their candling equipment. Do you remember? You probably don't remember Prestone coming in gallon tin cans? This is way back. They would cut a hole in the side and then put a small light down through the neck of the can. Therefore, they could candle or examine these eggs almost like an X-ray to see if there were any impurities in them. So I always liked to do that too. And then they were put into dozen cartons and taken into Lafayette to be sold at Robert's Grocery, which is another piece of history in Lafayette.
Wow.
Sometimes he would want me to ride on the horse with him. I was so allergic to animals, and especially horses and cows. So he would take a bucket of water and a gunny sack or a burlap bag and wet it down real good, and he would wet the horse so the dander wouldn't fly, and then he could ride me around for a little bit, and there was really not much use to wet the horse down because I usually had an asthma attack anyway, unfortunately. He also allowed me to drive his tractor, and I've got a check here that shows when he bought this tractor, February 11th, 1961. It was a Ford 8N, and that's what he paid for it, $2,700. And I always felt fortunate to be able to drive this tractor, and I couldn't have been, well, not old enough to have a driver's license, but at any rate, he would let me drive their car sometimes too. One of the most favorite things I did in the summer was to come out here in the front yard and I would lay under the white weeping birch tree, which was right out here, no longer there. But it was a beautiful tree, and you're familiar with what aspen bark looks like. This was a birch tree, and it was very much whiter than aspen. But it was just a full umbrella of leaves and so cool and beautiful under there. And while I would lay there, I would listen to the red-winged blackbirds and the meadowlarks. And there were lots of them back at that time. And, there was not all these houses around and that kind of thing. So that was a very pleasant memory. The other thing I would listen to, and I'll give you a bit of background, this road, 111th Street, was once called Lincoln Highway. And it was the main conveyance from Denver to Cheyenne back in the early 20th century. So the main traffic went by this house. And also along this road were many telephone poles and light poles, and the phone poles had the crossbars and the little insulators and things. Well, as I would be out here playing or laying under that tree, I would also listen to the telephone lines sing, and they actually made this kind of singing noise.
Not like that kind of singing.
Not like that kind of singing, a more pleasant kind of singing. But that was something I really did like to do, too. So, my next question.
We've been showing our viewers kind of the progress that we've made on the house. We opened up the walls and we saw where the original chimneys were, and kind of working on the various rooms and on all the details. You and I have talked a lot about, we have a lot of photos on the outside of the house, but we don't have a lot of photos on the inside of the house. And so maybe just give us a quick insight on what the inside of the house was like. Our viewers are kind of aware of that, but how much has it changed? And the stairs are a little bit different. And you talked about where the dining room was and where the living room.
Right. Well, I'll first say that I have this camera, which I bought today. This is the camera my grandfather used, probably from around 1915.
Wow.
And he took many, many pictures. I have hundreds of pictures, not all of which he took, but this is the camera. And I purposely looked that up a while back because when Luke asked me about pictures of the interior of the house, I could find almost none. And the reason is there was no flash attachment for cameras. And I think in about 1940 they finally came out with flash attachments. But my grandfather never had one, and he used this camera up until when he passed. But the inside of the house looks very similar now to the way it did look. The dining room and living room are very much the same, other than the archway between the two, and it was a beautiful woodwork.
Speaking of woodwork.
Yeah, the woodwork matched, the archway between those two rooms matched the other woodwork in the whole house, and it was all finished, and you'll find today that it has all been redone, and it looks as it did way back then. Okay. The living room, dining room, and 2 bedrooms were always wallpapered, and when my father bought this house back, the property in about in the 70s, he took the wall out between the 2 bedrooms downstairs and made it into 1 bedroom. So now there's only the 1 bedroom on the main floor. The kitchen is much the same as original, other than you mentioned the kitchen window and the sill that's lower than the actual sill.
I pointed that out last episode. Yep.
I presume that the kitchen sink was not where it is now, but it's always been there since my memory. And the bathroom has always been there since my memory as well. But initially, there were not the wonderful things that we know of today, such as electricity, central heating, air conditioning, indoor plumbing, and water. Yep. That was all lacking in this house. And along in the 1930s, the WPA came and built an outhouse here.
Still on site?
Which is still there. And the feature of it, which always fascinated me as a kid, was when you open the door, there's a rope attached to the door and to the seat, and the seat actually rises as you go into this outhouse. The kitchen and bathroom were always painted, and the woodwork in the kitchen was white, as well as the cupboards, just very stark white. And the kitchen is somewhat different now because my father added some additional cabinets and a place for a stove into where the other stove had been. Electricity came in the 1930s, I think, and as well as phone service. But one day, my mother came home from school as a young child, and nobody was in the house. She decided that she knew how to light the gas lanterns for lighting. So she got a chair and a match, climbed on the chair, and as she's turning on the gas and lighting this lantern, the gas is dripping on her dress. She didn't know, and she caught fire. So she ran outdoors, which is the wrong thing to do, but luckily one of the hired men was there and caught her and rolled her on the ground and actually probably saved her life. Wow. And she never talked about that, but I'm sure she probably remembered it to some degree. Anyway, I guess that's probably most of what I have to say, but I'd like to close and give my father some credit about this whole project happening, because it was his vision over all the years that he was associated with the Schofields and with the farm, even owning it. He envisioned this being a demonstration-type farm where early 20th century farming methods could be viewed, and with horses and so forth, and then the artifacts that have been saved by my family for over 150 years now are in my possession, and hopefully they will be displayed too somewhere so that people can get a flavor of what life used to be like in comparison to how we live today.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and we can't wait to kind of bring your family's vision to the farm and bring the community out here and have all those interpretation activities and all kinds of programs and events and things like that. We simply cannot wait for that to happen. Well, Patsy, thank you so much for coming out and
You're welcome.
Chatting with us, and can't wait for the next project to come about.
Right.
Can't wait until a couple months where we have the house all finished for you. So.
Well, I appreciate Erie taking this project over, and I especially appreciate you because I know your passion is about as great as mine as to get this all done.
Yes.
So thank you again.
It's been fun.
Good.
Thank you so much, Patsy.
Yes.
Appreciate it.
Okay.
All right, everybody, that is episode 4. Stay tuned. Here in a couple months, we'll be able to get back in the house and see some of the interior finishes. Can't wait. This is Luke Bolinger with Erie Parks and Recreation. Until next time.